Hi, everyone. This is John Rymer at analysis.tech. I'm here today to discuss discuss with you a new research paper we have just released. And I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan Duguid. Ryan, how are you today?
Good, great to be here. Great to discuss this topic. It's an interesting one because when you first brought it up with me, John, I found myself thinking, is this still a thing? So can't wait to dive into it.
Yeah, it is very much still a thing, Ryan, which is why we went after it. Real quickly, I got a comment and a concern from a friend over in Europe that he still hears about lock in as a barrier to adopting low code. And this should not be the case. So, anyway, let's dive in to the research that we did about this topic. Essentially, what we did as a group, I should add, was go back and just rethink lock in the context of low code. And we started by acknowledging that there is a what we call in the paper a traditional view of lock-in of any technology, low code included.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, the primary risks remain that people think about in the traditional sense of lock-in are these three risks. The vendor's going to have you locked in enough that they can raise costs beyond what you're comfortable with. The vendor will lock you in and then, for whatever reason, slow their pace of innovation, locking you out of important new ideas. And then lastly, the vendor fails to keep pace with technology advances. The big one recently was uh, vendors that were primarily had on premise products,
Yeah.
failing to keep pace with the cloud revolution that occurred, in the mid 2010s or so.
I think there's a couple of others as well, John, that yeah, these are obviously the big ones, but a couple jump to mind, especially with the pace of innovation and a lot of startups coming into the industry. There's one concern that's just, will this company be around? Right. Historically, go back as far as you and I do, and you think about a conversation, oh, am I using Java or .NET? It's not like Mark's, never say never, but it's unlikely Microsoft's going to go away. Now you see these VC-backed startups, and there's a question that says, are they still here in some period of time because they're burning cash? They're not profitable businesses.
Right.
Their business models predicate on fast-paced growth. I think that's one. And I
Yeah.
think the other thing in the world of SaaS, as you mentioned, that sort of shift from on-premise is quality and reliability of the service, where you can see degradation that can be of a concern. Those are the two I'd add into it, but these ones are typically where people go for sure.
Right. Right. So, in the traditional view, we outline this in a fair amount of detail in the paper. Just present the high level here. In the traditional view, low code platforms have these very common lock ins. They vary by product, but in general terms, you're locked in on the runtime, which is usually completely proprietary. You're locked in on the app format. You're locked in on the tools, the design tools, and the app management and administration tools. And you're usually locked into a cloud platform. Very few of the low code providers give you the ability to deploy the platform and your apps on the cloud platform of your choice, because that's really hard and expensive. What these points of lock in mean is essentially the traditional mitigation strategies uh, for uh, for preventing lock-in. Application portability is the first one, and technology substitutability is the second one. Are compromised. They're very difficult to achieve. Um, Ryan, anything you'd add there?
Yeah, what the interesting thing that's fascinating, I think, to give the vendor perspective on this, having spent the most of my career there, is that funnily enough, as the end customer is looking at the vendor of a low code platform with these concerns, the vendor of the low code platform in the era of cloud has the exact same set of concerns. So if you think about, say, my role in Nintex, where we have to decide to go from being an on-premise company to a cloud provider, we have to choose a cloud, right? and I look at the exact same thing. I'm about to build this thing. I could use AWS, I could use Azure, I could use GCP. Those are my choices. Once I pick one of those, unless I containerize everything, and this is 2013, 2014, not quite as easy as it is today, but unless I make a set of trade-offs to fully containerize my application, therefore not taking advantage of some of the native PaaS capabilities in those platforms, then I'm locked into that platform and it's hard for me to move. And then I have a set of people questioning me and my choices around building on this, saying, well, what if, right? Now, those what ifs are different. What if we build on Azure and Amazon decides to buy us? Is that a concern? Yes or no? And so you have to go through your own evaluation of these vendors and understand what your risks are and how you might mitigate them. So it speaks to the exact same conversation. So just something to think about, that you may be looking at the vendor thinking they're doing that to you. At the same time, every vendor's got that same set of concerns. So I think it's, these are all the typical valid concerns that people have, but also for everything you mentioned here, these are the magical benefits a low-code provider brings to you, because you don't have to worry about all this.
Right.
So what do you get in the runtime? What do you get from having a DSL domain-specific language that describes this application that can be imported and exported and is portable between that vendor's environments? What does it mean to have a set of drag and drop visual design tools and management capabilities? What it means is you don't have to code it yourself.
Right.
And if you coded it yourself, either you'd never get as far as these vendors get, so you'd have some poor man's version of that, or you'd spend a lot of time and energy not just coding it, but maintaining it over the lifetime.
Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that. Now, again, depending on the platform, because they're not all the same, generally there are these 6 what I call open points. So these are features that vendors will provide to give you greater flexibility and sometimes substitutability in working with a low-code platform. They give you openness that gives you more flexibility. Say if you feel like the vendor is really slowing down, if the vendor has good APIs, then you can add features or you can integrate with other products to keep the innovation flow going. As an example, source code generation is one that you'll hear about from some of the vendors that they will talk about as openness. In the paper, we take a hard look at that because it's not necessarily right for everybody. Some allow multi-cloud deployment. Some provide open source licensing, and that gives you flexibility to extend the platform or even contribute to it. Again, maybe perhaps keeping the innovation flow going. And then portable metadata is something that we're just starting to see, but it seems to be something that may come along and provide some help to alleviate concerns about lock-in. Ryan, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think with each of these, and to your point, the different vendors will promote different aspects of this. There are certainly so I think there's really 2 categories, right? There's a set of vendors in the low-code space who frankly would just tell you, do you own SAP? Great. Do you own Salesforce? Great. Was vendor lock-in a big concern when you had those conversations? Probably not, right? Now, you could argue there's data portability from those platforms, so that's not locked away. And I do think that's a super important thing to consider if you're betting on a low-code platform. How do you get at least core data, log history, all that kind of thing out of it if you have to? But if you think about all the complex business logic that's built around platforms like ERP, CRM, HRIS, it's impossible to ever get that out. So, but the vendors kind of sit in 2 camps. One, and I put myself in this category, honestly, I'm like, it's 2024. Why are we having this conversation, right? And the other camp is a set of people that have a history of open source and using technologies like Java and the likes, who lean more into this cloud portability, the open source license aspect of it and the likes. Now, these things are interesting, I would question, if I was a consumer of the technology, what does that really mean for me? So, for example, take open source licensing. This is super interesting. If the vendor goes out of business, you can pick it up and you can continue to run it yourself. Great. That's a bit like back in the day, source code escrow. If a vendor goes out of business, you can get the source code. Big question there would be, would you know how to run it?
Yeah.
Sounds great in theory, but would you actually know how to operationalize and run this thing? So question mark around that. Interesting, but question mark around it.
Yeah.
Multi-cloud deployment. This company runs my apps. Do I really care where they choose to run it? Is that important to me? Some edge case scenarios. Hey, I have all this data over in GCP, a few things in AWS. I'm facing ingress egress charges, bits and pieces like that, or it's slow because of latency issues. So that can be a thing. I think it's
regulation
right, regulations and the likes. Now, most of the more mature providers will allow you to choose things like data centers, geolocation, distribution, bits and pieces like that. The source code one, again, to your point, super interesting. Take Power Platform. I can get a Power app out and into Visual Studio, all the code, everything. Two things happen now. One, again, I have to sort of figure out how to run that myself.
Yep.
And two, I have to actually parse through all the code that's been generated and try to understand it.
Yep.
That's like the worst nightmare as a developer. Someone saying, here's this code you never wrote. There's a million lines of it. Go figure it out.
Yeah.
Now, in the era of AI-assisted coding and copilots, this does get a lot easier, right? But understand it's a one-way street. Once you take that source code and you start to evolve it, there's no going back, right? So I think these things, they're interesting. I'm not sure it's a panacea to, if your real concern is there around this, does that help? Are those the things you're worried about?
If your real concern, if you've got a traditional view of lock-in, if your real concern is, can I port my applications, if I need to, off of the platform onto a different platform?
Yeah.
And or can I substitute technology? These open points may provide some help, but there's
Correct.
no free lunch. There's
Correct.
no free lunch. And I echo your concerns about the open source licensing and source code generator. You've got to have a fair amount of skills and a real commitment to running your own tech, which a lot of companies just are not set up to do. So let's move on. Part of this research, guys, was as we went through the analysis of the using a traditional mindset, we had to recognize that the traditional mindset really arises from a much earlier era in technology. And we have to acknowledge that both the technology, the industry, and the technology that comes out of it, and business have changed dramatically in the present day. The rapid change is the norm on both dimensions, and so particularly for businesses that are using technology to solve problems or capture opportunities, the rapid change really leads them to approach technology in a certain way. Number one, we have to acknowledge, I think we have to recognize that customers value innovation way more than they value mitigation of vendor lock-in. They may talk about their concerns about vendor lock-in, and that actually may become a blocker to adopting technology. But at the end of the day, in most cases, innovation wins. And the second thing is that rapid change in both technology and in business really invalidates the two anti-lock-in strategies: application portability, and being application portability and technology substitutability. So in the paper, we talk about Lotus Notes as an example. Lotus Notes provided a huge amount of value to a huge number of companies over a long, long period of time. it has become kind of the poster child for the evils of lock-in. But wait a minute, huge amount of value out of those applications.
That's
And what happened was, after most companies were using some are still using Lotus Notes applications. Other companies started to peel off applications because their business changed, and low code makes it so easy relatively to replace those applications with modern ones that use cloud, that say do a better job than Notes did on process automation, that have a better user interface and a user experience than Lotus
what.
Notes ever did.
And I
But
think that's the key, John. Like that, this goes back to the point around. So the biggest concern is that sort of pace of innovation, and oftentimes that concern is less about features and functions, but it's experiential shift. And so if you look at the argument around Notes back in the day, it just it got tired and old, right? Kind of
yep,
know how it feels, right? And so it's
no,
and that's often what happens. Like a technology emerges, it moves really, really fast. My own experience was SharePoint. So people will be like, SharePoint sucks, like this. You got to remember that thing predate, like that's the tail end of the last century. The design concepts, the user experience concepts, and sure, at Microsoft, massive resources, and we constantly try to evolve and adapt that. But it's a big struggle because tech debt builds up, experience debt builds up over time. It gets harder and harder. Technologies shift, and so that's a lot of what happens is people start to feel like, oh, that something new's turned up that's more interesting. Now, we joked a bit before we got started today, right, about the picking a low-code technology is forming a partnership with a vendor, and we'll jump into it in a minute, right, in more
yep,
detail. But think of it as a marriage is always sort of how you talk about this. You now, maybe it's not for a lifetime, maybe it's for a season or a set of seasons, but you choose a technology vendor, you work with that vendor over a period of time, you have your own role to play in that relationship, by the way. You don't, to your, we're joking, but you don't just get married and go, okay, I can kick back now and relax, right?
right,
And so, and over some season of time, potentially you go in different directions or that vendor goes in different directions, and then it's time to move on. Now, when you think about low code technologies, then what you're asking yourself is how much value can I extract over that period of time where this all makes sense? Like, let's hope it lasts forever.
right.
But if it's like Lotus Notes, okay, I got a decade to your point of immense value, and then I had to start progressively rebuilding some of my applications. Now, having been in that Notes migration phase into, say, SharePoint, a lot of those apps were outdated. A lot
That's
weren't being used much anymore. A lot of the requirements had changed. And it was actually a good time. It was a refresher
yes,
to cull some apps, to bring some new ones over, and then to be able to do things with this new platform that you couldn't do with the old one.
yeah.
So I think that's a mindset people need to take into this.
Absolutely, and the idea of application portability in the current environment just to me makes no sense at all, because the business, as you said, the requirements change so quickly. You're not going to want to port that application for.
That's
You're not
right.
going to want to live on that application for maybe even 10 years, not much
Right.
less 20 or 30 years, like some of the
Uh,
mainframe apps.
And
Uh,
you could probably rebuild faster as well because you've learned a lot. You've defined your requirements more clearly. And because technology is moving really quickly, you can potentially, hey, we can now all start talking to computers and describe our application needs and get something going. Or if you work with a vendor that does have an exportable definition language, and I've been playing a bit with this myself, for those vendors that let you kind of import, export, and you've got an XML or a JSON payload of some sort, you can actually feed that to something like GPT and say, hey, tell me what this does.
yeah,
And you'd be surprised how good a job it can do of understanding the underlying platform and
yeah,
what it's up to.
interesting. So we close the paper by trying to provide a simple tool for people to think about lock-in and assess lock-in um, in a more modern framework. So there are two aspects of this, and Ryan, you just highlighted them. The first is, how should you assess vendors? So rather than go and look at standards, the standards they support, or the licensing and so forth, look at the vendor's focus and look at what the goals of the vendor are. If the vendor's goals are profitability over growth or profitability, that usually means they're not going to invest in innovation as much as maybe some other vendors would. And if innovation is really important to you and your business goals, you probably want to look at a different vendor.
Mm-hmm.
Ownership goals, you can do due diligence on this. There's a lot of good information. You can basically, you're going to, as Brian said, you're going to establish a relationship with a vendor anyway. You might as well start with a good, deep conversation with that
Ask,
reps.
ask some questions, find out if your values are aligned, all that kind of stuff. To your point, John, this is easier than ever before, right? The ability to find social evidence from
Yep.
peers in the industry or people on G2 or any of these platforms is immense. Looking at Crunchbase to understand who are the investors, what kind of capital is behind this, and then just ask the questions. Like, how much of your revenue, what percentage of revenue do you spend on R&D? What
That's
percentage on sales and marketing, right? Like,
yeah.
dig a little deeper.
That's a really key piece of data that we call out here. So think of this as a little sheet, a little tool you can have while you're having the conversation with the vendor and start to jot all this information down. Staying power is an important one. You don't want to create a relationship with a vendor that ends up going out of business. And so the traditional view of this is nobody ever got fired from IBM for working with IBM back in the day. These days, it's more like nobody ever got fired for going with Microsoft or Oracle or what have you. But the bigger vendors are not the only ones that have staying power. The
Yep.
smaller vendors can improve their staying power by making really smart use of ecosystems. So there's one vendor, there's a number of vendors, for example, in the Microsoft ecosystem that are taking advantage of all of the AI features and services that Microsoft has begun to release. They don't have to build all those. They just have to those services. They can spend their R&D more on access and incorporating those services into a very powerful experience. So it's not only that the biggest vendors always win, it's being smart about looking at a vendor's commitment to an ecosystem and using that ecosystem to improve their staying power. Pricing models is a big one. Vendors' pricing model, there are lots of them. There are lots of what I think of as meters. Do they charge you by the user? Do they charge you by the app? Do they charge you by the resource? Is there some other model they give you? And do they actually do some vendors have multiple models? This is really important as a way of gauging the way that the vendor's costs are likely to behave. And it's very much not about the vendor so much as about you and about, are you going to have lots and lots of apps? Well, then, per app may not be if you have lots of apps and few users, per user is probably better for you. And doing that sort of analysis is really important to understand how the costs are likely to behave. And then lastly, vendors that are growing tend to be in a position to invest in innovation. And so look at the vendor's growth, look at the annual rate, look at the track record, look at the resources they have available to them to fuel growth. Ryan, anything you'd add? Anything
Yeah,
else?
again, it's just dig as deep as you need to feel comfortable. And what I would suggest to people is there's just so many ways to get answers to these questions. Public company, super easy. And in fact, if a company's public, that probably gives you some indication of the answers to these questions, right?
Right.
They're not public companies, private companies, VC backed or PE backed. Again, Crunchbase, great resource. Jumping in, figuring out where everybody's at. To your point, how many people have they got working? Get on LinkedIn, do a search, find out who are they hiring, how does that change over time, and then just ask the questions. A lot of vendors, maybe you'll have to be under NDA, but a lot of vendors will share this kind of information if this is a deep concern and it's something that you could put forward to say, hey, I need to know this to feel comfortable progressing.
Right. And then you have to assess yourself. It's really it's really kind of remarkable, and maybe it's obvious, maybe I guess maybe not, but a lot of times a relationship with a vendor goes south because the customer is not set up to actually use that vendor's product effectively,
Yep.
or they're not they just haven't put in place kind of their prerequisites in process, in expertise, etc., uh, to really use that vendor's product effectively. So these are sort of top level concerns that you questions you have to ask about yourself. We think, starting with what's your focus. If you are really if innovation is really the value here, and you're looking for the latest and greatest features to fuel business innovation, um, certain vendors are going to rise to the top there because that's what they're about. They're always going to be out on the leading edge. If what you're looking for is modernization, and innovation maybe isn't so important, when you get into modernization, you're talking then your values are stability, scalability, security, etc. Those features rise to the top of the list, and innovation becomes secondary. And I know these are just two focuses, but try to be honest with yourself about what you're really trying to accomplish, and then you're going to be better able to match your focus to the vendors.
I
Um,
think the big thing here, John, is, and we have a discussion coming up about this in the not too distant future, is just your willingness to commit to the effort, your willingness to build the center of excellence, your willingness to
yep,
train people, to empower people, to put good governance
yep,
processes in place.
yep,
That's what really makes a difference here. And if you don't have that, then this stuff gets a little more challenging. And so that's, to your point, you need to be signing up for that commitment in
right,
order to get the most out of your vendor relationship.
right. So we've listed readiness here. Do you have an iterative development process? Do you have any iterative development processes that you actually use and can trust, and so forth? This is all outlined in the paper. In the interest of time, Ryan, I think we should saw this off. Whoops. Let's end on that note, and and mention that this paper is available for free on analysis.tech. Look under our research tab for all of our papers, and it's all free to access. And please leave us your comments and suggestions on this research, because we will be continuing to look at this very important question. Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Great
day.
discussion, John. Thanks.